Ahoy there, wreck hunters, and welcome back to Wreck Pirates, brought to you by Kraken Charters, the show where we dive deep into maritime history, unearthing the stories of shipwrecks scattered along our coasts and beyond. I'm Captain Tom, piloting this episode today, and with me is our dive master, Ben. If you want to learn more about our crew, head over to krakenchartersva.com and click the menu in the upper left-hand corner. There you can explore our scuba diving section to read about the sites we visit, the training classes we offer, and much more. To keep up to date on our episodes, you can find us on Spotify, Apple iTunes, YouTube, and wherever else you get your podcasts. You can also visit us on patreon.com for exclusive content. We're your dive buddies above and below the surface, exploring the wrecks, stories, and skills that make up the diving world of Virginia and North Carolina. Today, we dive into a story of wartime peril off the Virginia coast. It's the vessel SS Francis E. Powell, an American tanker carrying raw petroleum, otherwise known as black gold, along the eastern seaboard. Her story is one of strategy, danger, and survival during World War II, and ending in tragedy after a sudden U-boat attack.
The Francis E. Powell was a 7,096 gross ton tanker, built in the early 1920s and owned by the Atlantic Refining Company of Philadelphia. She transported fuel oil and gasoline along the East Coast, an unglamorous but vital role for both commerce and wartime logistics. These tankers were huge targets during the early years of World War II. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, looking to disrupt fuel supplies to the Allies. Being a tanker off the East Coast in 1942 was extremely dangerous. On January 27, 1942, the Powell departed Port Arthur, Texas, bound for Providence, Rhode Island, and loaded with 80,000 barrels of fuel. Unescorted and blacked out, she sailed along the Virginia coast, exactly where danger would strike.
At 0943, the German submarine U-130, under Captain Lieutenant Ernst Kahls, fired a torpedo at the Powell, roughly 8 miles northeast of the winter quarter light vessel. The torpedo struck the port side between tanks 4 and 5, leaking oil as a thick black sludge onto the surface of the Atlantic. The explosion caused a fire in the pump room and destroyed the ship's radio antenna. Without radio communication, the crew couldn't call for help. The ship started to list and burn, and chaos broke out as the crew abandoned critical areas. By 2 p.m., the tanker had broken in two and sank in the frigid Atlantic. The fire still burned as it went under, leaving debris and survivors scattered in the water.
The Powell had a crew of 32, 8 officers and 24 crew members. Tragically, 4 were lost, including the captain, and 28 survived, rescued by nearby vessels respawning after debris and lifeboats were sighted nearly 9 hours later. The survivors endured freezing temperatures, gale-force winds, and rough seas. Reports describe a desperate fight to reach life rafts and keep afloat amidst oil slicks.
So the story of the Powell on how this sank is pretty common for what we see here off the East Coast or in World War II, right? The Atlantic here was a hunting grounds for all the U-boats, and they actually had a term for it back then.
I'm not sure what term you're talking about, but you're right about it being early in 1942, early in the war effort when the Americans were just getting involved. This was when German U-boats were going crazy and sinking tons of ships off the East Coast.
Yeah, the U-boats operated in relatively shallow water, and there is a term, and it was called Torpedo Alley, and I think it was one of the actual U-boat captains who was responsible for sinking a lot of the ships here off the East Coast.
They definitely had a field day, and it's interesting that you noted that they primarily operated in shallow water. And I actually have a little tidbit of submarine history here. Submarines nowadays can go to pretty deep depths. They have pretty deep crush depth, which exceeds anything a scuba diver could possibly go in. But in that day, they didn't have any type of nuclear-powered submarine. Everything was on diesel, and the submarines were built actually primarily to be surface ships that could dive to escape detection or to escape attacks as needed. So they did primarily attack in littoral waters that were a little closer to shore. So World War II subs kind of transitioned to deeper water subs actually in the Cold War, or kind of 20 years later after World War II missions. So it was a transition from World War II style subs that the Germans had, that Americans also had at the time, towards the deeper diving submarines that you see the US and Russians have today.
Yeah, that's a good note. Most people don't really think about it. They think of submarines. They think of deep going down, all that stuff, and it just wasn't the case. What's crazy about this one, like if you think about it, right? These, merchant mariners were part of this war effort and were casualty wars. This wasn't a military cargo ship or anything. This was just your everyday oil tanker that you see traversing the Chesapeake Bay and East Coast as of today. And what's even crazier about this is that this could have gone way worse than it actually did. I mean, there was 28 of the 32 people survived, and the oil didn't somehow catch fire, even though it took a direct impact from a torpedo. And you think about it, you're like, oh, you see these movies, and a torpedo hits a ship, and it explodes and creates this catastrophic like domino effect, or it takes out the whole ship, and this did not occur.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to note that the Germans' focus was disrupting logistics. So while they were sinking a lot of ships, when they had lifeboats and survivors, they weren't necessarily taking their machine guns out and going to finish off survivors. It wasn't a military engagement in that sense. But speaking of getting lucky, yeah, 28 of 32 survived. One of the casualties was the captain, though, and I thought it was interesting when I was reading this passage in Gary Gentile's book that the captain had actually made it to a lifeboat with a number of the survivors before he decided to go back to his quarters to retrieve something, and no one knows what it was, because when he retrieved the item and came back to the lifeboat, he actually slipped and hit his head as he was falling overboard and disappeared into the waters below. So I'll ask you, like, what do you think he was going back for?
That's hard to say. But if you think about, especially some of these old time captains who, back in 1942, he wasn't a new captain, right? And as a merchant mariner, he'd probably been doing this for a very long time, probably an older gentleman. And it's probably something that had been done in his family and been like, just following your father's footsteps kind of thing. And it could be his great-grandfather. His great-great-grandfather was a ship captain, and and all the way down to him. And it could have been something that was passed down like from that era, like a handheld compass or a sextant or something along those lines, or it could have been a picture of his mistress. Who knows?
Yeah, she must have been really good looking then, huh? It's also amazing how quickly things went down. The captain went and tried to retrieve whatever he was retrieving, and then he didn't make it back. And by then, the lifeboats were off, and it had been 5 minutes between when the torpedo struck and when all the lifeboats were off and the ship started to go down.
It does not take long. I've known several people that have lost ships or boats when they're just out fishing or doing whatever, and it's seconds before boats can go down. Barely have enough time to grab a life jacket or a handheld radio or flare kit. I mean, it's almost no time at all. Like these days, like we have hydrostatic releases for our life rafts and for our EPIRBs and things like that, and we try to keep everything in like a very accessible location because it does happen quickly. I remember we were actually diving out of Oregon Inlet, and we were coming back, and there was guys fishing inside the inlet, and they had their lines hung up in an old pound net or something that was down there at the bottom of the inlet, and they were trying to free their lines, and the captain is yelling to tell them to cut it, and they got their props hung up in that net, and as soon as that happened, it was 10 seconds. The stern of that boat, because of the current, got overwhelmed with water, and that boat was underwater in less than 10 seconds.
Yeah, and Oregon Inlet is a really bad place for that to happen too, because the current can really rip through there, right? And for those of you who don't know, Oregon Inlet is in the Outer Banks, just south of the town of Nags Head. And it's one of the most, what would you call it, Tom? Like one of the more notorious inlets in our area.
Yeah, it's definitely one that comes with the local knowledge of how to navigate, because it changes from season to season as far as the shoaling goes, because the amount of water that's flowing from Pamlico Sound, but I mean, it's a pretty treacherous inlet, and you definitely need local knowledge to get in and out of that safely, especially at night. There's been multiple boats that have capsized, sunk, or ran aground in that inlet. Even in the past 6 months, there's been at least two that I can think of people that died coming in and out of the inlet.
Yeah, I remember just 2 months ago, there was a big, 50-foot or more sport fishing boat that went down in the inlet, had a casualty because he hit some breakers wrong coming in the inlet. So it happens, and that was an inexperienced captain too. So it can happen to anybody if you're not on top of your game.
Well, as the wreck sits today, the Powell lies in multiple sections off Virginia's coast at varying depths. Currents and fires have broken up the structure over decades, and now it's mostly metal with remnants of the hull. It's also a concern for environmental agencies because of the remaining fuel oil. Divers treat it as a historical site rather than a recreational dive. But still, it's a haunting reminder of the wartime of the Atlantic. Pieces of the tanker, the pumps, the hull plates tell a story of engineering, danger, and human endurance. And I'll say that the two sections that we have for this wreck, main one that's typically most people fish is about 30-ish miles off the coast, out of the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. It sits in roughly 75 to 90 feet of water, and it's pretty sanded over. There's not much relief on this shipwreck. It's a great place though to catch black sea bass and tautog and flounder, but it's just kind of a scattered field of just like metal structures poking up out of the sand because it's so broken up and there's not much there. It's still a good dive to go do, just because the ease of it. There's a couple good places to hook off on, and if you're a spear fisherman, it's a great site. And there's still a lot artifacts that could be seen and be found there as far as like parts of the ship, but you're not going to find any like cool wartime memorabilia or anything like that. No ammo, no guns, nothing crazy. Just maybe a ship's light or bolt or whatever you might come across of. If it's going to be on a merchant mariner ship during that time that was just carrying oil.
Yeah, this one's a little different than the John Morgan that we talked about last episode, which was actually carrying wartime goods like ammunition and tanks. This one it was just an oil tanker, so it doesn't have all that same material in it. But I did want to talk about what you mentioned before with this being more of a scattered debris field. That makes it so there's tons of hiding space and it supports a lot of life. And it can still be great to go and dive on these wrecks and just explore the different structure. Definitely with the wreck reel though, because when there's not an intact, sideboard of the ship or structure of the ship, it does make it hard to navigate. And to add on to that, you mentioned one of the pieces of the ship. So this is something that's still to this day kind of an unknown, is that there's the piece that you're talking about, which more people kind of dive and fish on off of Virginia Beach. There's another piece that was identified just even right after the war ended in 1944 by a diver put down on a line by the Navy. They identified a piece of the Powell up further off the coast of the eastern shore, and he stated that piece was the bow end. Now, divers went back 30 or 40 years later in the kind of like late 70s and 80s, dove on that same piece off the eastern shore, and they said that they saw the shaft going to the propeller and a fantail stern. So they said they went to the same piece, and they said that piece is actually the stern. Now, with the other piece blown up, we don't know which end is the one off Virginia Beach, so it's a little bit of a mystery there.
Yeah, I haven't dove the inshore section just because it's shallower. Currents and visibility there can be really tricky, and it's just it's not something for inexperienced divers, and the chances of seeing stuff might be slim and none. I mean, at wintertime is probably a pretty decent dive because visibility in the winter here is actually fantastic. It's just really cold. Um, but I'd like to talk for you to talk more on um the part of the ship that's out there about 30 miles and how it was actually I guess you'd call it a hazard to navigation, or I'm sorry, take that back. It was, was it a hazard to navigation of why it got blown up, or was it something else? Like, well, why was it blown up more than whatever already was from the fire?
So the reason that one section is blown up and the other one is not is because they separated early on after the explosion, basically right after the ship went down or as it was going down. And the one section there kind of remained off the eastern shore. The other section actually was blown by these strong winds that we described earlier and went further kind of southeast to the location that you're talking about. And that section, like several months later, actually now that I read it, over a year later, in May 1943, a B-18 that was flying out of Langley Field, which is now Langley Air Force Base, registered a hit on their magnetometer above that second section off Virginia Beach there. And then later on, just like a week later, the U.S. sent out a Coast Guard ship and basically like set off an explosion at that location, thinking that it could be something that's a hazard to navigation. It could have been a submarine or something like that. But basically, they got this hit on their magnetometer, and they sent a Coast Guard ship out, and they blew whatever it was up, not knowing what it was. Well, now we know it was just the wreckage, the other half of the Powell. But that's why that one is so beat up, so torn up, whereas the other piece is more intact, despite it being more inshore. There's actually kind of a third twist to this story too, where we have a report from March 8th, 1942. So this is 3 months after the sinking of the ship, and actually before the piece was blown up in Virginia Beach, that says there was a Coast Guard cutter off the coast of the Outer Banks there, basically off the coast of Bodie Island, Nag's Head, out of Oregon Inlet. And this Coast Guard cutter thought it detected a submarine, kind of similar, like magnetometer sighting, and it dropped a charge and had this kind of anti-submarine attack. And what happened there is that a piece of debris surfaced after that attack, and the debris was marked Francis E. Powell. So that twist means it means likely one of two things happened. Either there was a third piece of debris of the wreck that floated even further south off of the Outer Banks, or the German U-boat had kind of taken a trophy, taken a souvenir from its first capture, from its first sinking, and then either used it as a diversion when this Coast Guard cutter off the Outer Banks tried to attack it, or had to release it because it was kind of hit and damaged. Historians kind of lean towards the theory that it was this piece of the Francis Powell was taken as a souvenir and then used as a diversion, because the German U-boat, the U-130, that is supposed to have sunk the Francis Powell, didn't sink and was registered as sinking much later in 1943, in March 1943. So it didn't sink and release any of its souvenirs at that time, but it may have used that as a diversion so that this cutter thought it hit something. Meanwhile, kind of providing cover for the submarine to escape.
Yeah, I mean, they're all plausible stories and theories, and unfortunately, we'll never know until we can either find wherever that Coast Guard boat was and search and look for our own wreck. Then maybe another piece of the Powell, or all those submariners are long gone these days. But it just goes to show that what lies beneath the waves is more than just a shipwreck. It's more than just a war grave. There's this shroud of mystery, and I think that's what pulls in a lot of these divers, especially like these hardcore divers, to these shipwrecks. It's certainly what pulls me in. I enjoy the history and like, what can I find? Can I be that next, person to be the next discoverer of what it is we might find, or discover a new shipwreck that we thought was something else and end up being actually something totally different. And because there's a lot of marks. If you look at my chart plotter, there's all kinds of marks, and several of them just say unknown. Right? It's just a piece of debris down there, and it could be a washer and dryer that someone dumped down there to be a fish attracting device, or it could actually be something of legitimate piece of war history that we'll just never know. And just unfortunately, there's just not enough time in the day or life to dive them all and check them all out.
That was definitely part of the appeal of getting into scuba diving when I was first starting. It's not only just seeing these mesmerizing sights, seeing the wildlife, the fish, the sharks, the rays that can be on the wrecks below the surface, but it's also the opportunity to see a piece of history, but also to solve a mystery. There's so many unknowns. It really is like exploring another frontier. And speaking of that, we actually have an episode coming up next that is about another ship which has actually not been positively identified, which feeds into the mystery of that shipwreck. But that's all I'll say for this week about that one.
So the Francis E. Powell reminds us that the ocean is no respecter of size, cargo, or intent. A massive tanker, critical for fuel, went down in hours due to a single torpedo. It also reminds us how merchant mariners face the front lines of war, even off their own coast. Their story is preserved in metal and memory, a silent warning and tribute to those who sailed through peril.
That's all for this dive into the wreck of Francis E. Powell. If you enjoyed this episode, hit subscribe, leave a rating, and share Wreck Pirates with your crew.
If you got a wreck you want us to cover, drop us a line on Spotify or hit us up on Facebook or Instagram.
Next time, we'll explore a freighter in a different era, a non-World War II wreck. Don't miss that one.
So until then, where history sinks, we die. Join us next time on Wreck Pirates.